Star Wars 7x7, episode 1886. Today, the Grysk are the big bad that are lurking around the corners in Thrawn alliances and come to the fore in Thrawn Treason. They also happen to have ties to the First Order and the Empire, of course. We'll talk about all that in today's episode. Punch it! Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod and this is Star Wars 7x7. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode. So the Grysk, these are potentially the next big bad in Star Wars. And, you know, sometimes I wonder if what we're getting in the novels or the comics or, you know, any other media that is in TV or film is a trial run potentially for a new kind of villain, and, you know, getting the idea of whether they are, you know, good enough, strong enough, interesting enough to make the jump from canon media that is not necessarily absorbed by as many people as TV and films are, and, you know, moving them on into these new arenas if the desire seems right. And it seems like the Grysk are sort of being groomed for this possibility. So let's just give you a brief history of what we know, which is very little actually, of the Grysk hegemony. They are from the unknown regions as well, and they have been monitoring what's been going on in the known galaxy for quite some time. In fact, according to Thrawn alliances, they had been in touch with Count Dooku and the Separatists and were helping them to build lightsaber-resistant droids. But of course, Count Dooku was doing them one better and actually using the materials that he had learned about from the Grysk to create lightsaber-resistant clone trooper armor. And the purpose of that, of course, would be for them to be able to better defend themselves when the Emperor flipped the switch on Order 66. As far as what their intentions were to the Galactic Empire, well, it seems like information gathering and technology theft were high among their priorities, at least as far as what we've learned from Thrawn alliances and Thrawn Treason. But for what purpose? Well, one of the things that the Grysk hegemony does is take over other species, and they are referred to as clients, as Grysk clients, these other species that are working on behalf of the Grysk. And they do this in a couple of ways. One of them is described as the Grysk learning what the deepest desires or deepest fears are of a particular species and using that to control and manipulate them on a large scale. That's option one. Option two, which is a little bit more sneaky, a little more subterfuge oriented, is to do that for a very small part of a species' population, of course, a ruling part of the population. And so instead of getting an entire species to, you know, bend its will to the will of the Grysks, they get the ruling party of the species to bend and follow the Grysk and have those rulers ultimately guide their people in such a way as to support the Grysk overall objectives, which is, you know, taking over stuff and being the dominant species in the unknown regions. And it's this latter situation that I think Thrawn sees as the biggest threat to the Empire. It's not the notion of them turning humans into a client species across the Galactic Empire, because that might take quite a lot of work. No, instead, it would be to try to gain control of the upper echelons of the Imperial government and turn those members of the ruling class into clients. Now, of course, Emperor Palpatine is sort of a situation unto himself, being that he is supremely force powerful and probably would not necessarily go so quietly as far as the Grysks go. But as far as the Grysk being able to manipulate people who are not force sensitive, well, that seems like a pretty strong possibility, and that's where I think Thrawn sees the greatest potential for the Empire to fall under the sway of the Grysk. Now, what might that have to do with the First Order? Well, we know that Thrawn was instrumental in helping the Emperor be able to start to understand access to the unknown regions and be able to get some of his factions into the unknown regions after the Battle of Jakku as part of his big contingency plan for a new empire to rise and essentially for what the First Order would become. However, There's not somebody like Emperor Palpatine who went off into the unknown regions with these remnants of the Empire, and so therefore there's not really anyone in the Empire who escaped, as far as we know, who would be able to withstand the particular terror that the Grysk hegemony would be able to unleash upon these Imperial remnants. And so you would imagine that it's potentially possible for the Grysk to have taken over the remnants of the Empire, and for them to be creating the First Order under the Grysk tutelage. Now, there is no real good look at what a Grysk might look like. There's no depictions of any kind or anything like that. Probably won't get one unless they do an adaptation of Thrawn Alliances for the comics, all right? But they are described as having wide shoulders and angular brows and deep-set eyes, and naturally one wonders whether Snoke might be a Grysk based on that. And it doesn't seem to quite fit, although, he does have, malformed facial features, so, it doesn't necessarily have to match up with a Grysk. Jury's kind of out on that. Maybe, maybe not. But he would certainly be somebody who, like Emperor Palpatine, would be powerful enough in theory to be able to resist whatever influence the Grysk might adopt. However, there is one direct link between Snoke and the Grysk that was revealed in Thrawn Treason, and I will share that with you after the break. Stay tuned. This episode is brought to you by Constant Contact, the premier email marketing solution for small businesses and organizations. I've used their service since 2003, and over the past decade and a half, I've watched them evolve, make the product simpler, more powerful, easy to use, and do everything that they can to help train people to use the product more effectively and for it to work with other forms of marketing like social media, for example. So check out sw7x7.com/email to learn more about Constant Contact and start a free trial. Once again, that is sw7x7.com/email for a free trial. Welcome back. So, cast your mind back to The Last Jedi and Snoke's throne room, okay? So, Snoke is in there, and his elite Praetorian Guard is in there, but there are also some other folks in there. They're very tall and thin and had purple robes on. These are the attendants, and The Last Jedi Visual Dictionary talks about them having blazed hyperspace trails in the unknown regions that the Empire would ultimately use to be able to escape and recoup and eventually form the First Order. And these are the trails that Thrawn would eventually talk to Palpatine about to help him, as part of his contingency, figure out how remnants of his empire could escape and form the First Order down the line. Well, it turns out that these attendants were actually working for the Grysk earlier in time, during the days of the Galactic Empire, a few years before the events of Star Wars: A New Hope, at least. Whether the attendants went from working with the Grysk to working with the First Order, or whether they just, had some of their species working with the Grysk and eventually some other of their species working with the First Order, that is a question that remains unknown. But it is rather interesting that these attendants who helped blaze hyperspace trails in the First Order eventually worked for both the Grysk and for the First Order and Supreme Leader Snoke. And so there is your very intriguing tie between Thrawn, Treason, and the Grysk, who could be the biggest new threat in the galaxy, and the First Order, in other words, the sequel era, and who knows, maybe the Rise of Skywalker as well? That might be a little much, but we'll see. And for now, that is going to do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for joining me for it. And as always, may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.
This podcast is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox. It is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other related Star Wars items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright 2019 by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.